Okay, so now we're going to talk about startups in the past. So, startups in the past. Previously, we talked about how, today we associate startups with the Valley and computer science, VCs, and so on. But in the past, they were actually in other businesses. So, oil, steel, pharmaceuticals, and telegraphs in the 1800s US, and in the early 1900s of the US, it was the automobile, aviation, and telephone industries that could best be characterized as startups. And what's really interesting is that there's nothing new under the sun, right? So, for example, just like early internet companies use some variant of .com in their names, early car companies tended to bear the last names of their founders. So, Amazon.com survived and Pets.com did not. Just like Ford and Chrysler survived to the present day, while all these other companies that were named in kind of similar fashion to Ford and Chrysler, Auburn, Bates, Christie, and Desperon, did not survive. There was actually this huge Cambrian explosion of hundreds of startup car companies. And you can go through and see this huge, huge list of all of these startup car companies that existed in the early 1900s, and very, very few of them, made it to the present day. But every once in a while, you will see like a company that you recognize, like a Ford, just in the middle there, right? Just in the middle of this whole long list, and no one knows about Lenawee or Matheson or Wilson or any of those other companies, but you do remember Ford. In the same way that you'll have like a Google.com started around the same time as a Foo.com and an Example.com at the same time. So the interesting thing about these early startup industries was basically that a very small amount of capital was required to start a business, and there weren't any regulations or technological barriers, quality barriers that kept you out. So, for example, Samuel Kier, he started an oil refinery on 7th and Grant, which is insane. Imagine if you've ever seen what an oil refinery looks like. It's got enormous columns, and it's this billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar facility, and to visualize starting that on 7th and Grant, like in your apartment in a city, is astonishing to think that that's where that industry began. But tracing back things in history is very, very interesting because oil started like that. The huge oil industry started like that. The steel industry started like that. Carnegie constructed his first steel mill, and built this enormous enterprise. Eli Lilly, this huge, diversified global pharmaceutical conglomerate. Eli Lilly started out of sort of the back of a pharmacy. He created a medical wholesale company while working in partnership at a drugstore named Binford and Lilly. So out of the back of a drugstore, in his first year of business, sales were $4,470. And I mean, of course, inflation adjusted, that's not too bad at that time for a single person. But it's pretty interesting to see how these companies started out. It's in these areas in particular. If you think about oil or steel or pharmaceuticals, you do not think I'm going to go and start that in a garage. But that's pretty much what these people did. And the thing is that one of the reasons that you can't do that today is to build an oil refinery that's competitive with Exxon's oil refinery. That's a multi-billion-dollar endeavor, and most people don't have the capital to do that. But the second aspect is not just the capital, but the regulations. So, for example, if you've ever heard of Banting and Best, they won the Nobel Prize, and the way they won it is in 1921 they came up with the idea for using insulin to treat diabetes. In 1922 they had extracted insulin, tested on themselves, tested on animals, and put it in a patient's arm. And by 1923 Banting and Best had won the Nobel Prize. And so, a time frame of this kind, that you could not do that today. Today it requires, literally $4 billion to ship a drug. And the way you can figure that out is you take, drug companies and you take their R&D spending and you divide it by the number of drugs, and you can figure out, exactly, or rather, this is actually the R&D spending divided per drug, and so the lowest on the list is on the order of like $4 billion. Novartis is very efficient because they only spend $4 billion. AstraZeneca spends more like $12 billion. Now, you can take these with a grain of salt, and you can say, okay, well, they spent $60 billion, and that's our R&D line. But the fact that these people are spending tens, hundreds of billions of dollars and not really shipping that many drugs is pretty interesting. The interesting point, though, is that the 1 billion number is actually a substantial underestimate relative to this quotient here. So that's drugs. Drugs are $4 billion. Another example is like Boeing or the Lockheed Martin. Most people don't know this, but the Wright brothers, they started an airline company out of a bike store, and that actually was at one point merged with the ancestor of Lockheed Martin. It became its own independent corporation, the Curtiss Wright Corporation. It's still a $1 billion business today. So he started a $1 billion aircraft company out of a bike store. And part of the reason for that is there was no FAA. Just like when Banting and Best were around, the FDA was there, but it was embryonic. It wasn't what it was, after the 1930s. It was much, much weaker. It didn't have something called pre-market review. And so the thing is that without regulation, what happened? You had this messy process of innovation. You had all these deaths from refinery fires and railroad collisions, car explosions, airplane crashes, drug overdoses. And those injuries were accepted as a price of progress. But over time, what happened was basically regulations were written that criminalized the provision of beta quality physical products. This is a very important point, that you can't just ship a drug. You can't have a drug company whose philosophy is move fast and break things. At least not in the modern U.S. You need an environment that was much more risk tolerant, and that's not where we are today. So the net result, though, is barriers to entry rose very sharply, and you can kind of visualize that over here. I won't read every line, but you can visualize that. You have this Cambrian explosion over here. There's this rise that happens, and then you've got some guys, over here that are the winners. And so these large winners, they erect technological barriers. For example, competing with Google's data centers or Amazon's, server farms is non-trivial. But in addition, what happens is during this rise process, the rapid growth causes failures. Those failures attract regulatory attention, and that regulatory, attention also increases barriers to entry. Exxon or pharmaceuticals or steel mills, these all are very heavily regulated industries, and that adds to kind of the difficulty of going and competing with them. Okay, so this is kind of the concept of startups of the past. Let's break from there, and then next we'll talk about startups in the present.